So the result of that whole process that I just laid out, which applies equally in Iraq and anywhere else, and if you think through how it's going to work, what it yields is it's going to yield a redistribution from citizens to government, or as I've already mentioned, from citizens to other citizens. So in the first step, there was redistribution from the tailor and the falafel vendor to the Peshmerga. And then the next step was there was also redistribution from the Peshmerga, their time, energy, and resources, to the bureaucrats. And so it includes both the beneficiaries of government programs, in the case the Peshmerga, and also to the bureaucrats. So it is possible for government to stimulate the economy in the short run through increasing the money supply and passing out goodies. In effect, what's going to happen is we're going to stimulate the economy by tricking people. A few months later, they're going to say, wait, what the heck? I just worked my butt off for this extra money, and this extra money gets me nothing extra. And eventually, they're going to stop working their butt off when they see an increase in the price that they are paid for their goods and services. And so what it can end up being is you can end up with high rates of inflation and no increase in the growth rate in the economy, much like you saw over there in the previous graph with Peru. This, of course, leads to some questions with our current stimulus package. In effect, what is the federal government doing? The idea is we're going to send out checks to every citizen, of course, up to a certain income threshold, and this will stimulate the economy. Now, that isn't necessarily using the money supply. It's possible that the federal government is going to, guess what? They're going to tax. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think in the current environment we're going to run a balanced budget. And in fact, the federal government hasn't run a balanced budget since the 1920s. I'm not talking about a balanced budget in any given year. I'm talking about big picture balanced budgets. And so we have an increase. Another option is going to be to borrow money, and we can look at the impact of that. So if you go back to our market for loanable funds, we can look at what happens when government borrows money. It increases the aggregate demand, no change in the private demand. It increases interest rates and decreases the amount of money that makes it across the bridge into private hands, thus decreasing our investment rate from the private sector, thus shifting our investment line down. And the question then would be does the federal government use that money more effectively than the private sector? But in this case, what they're doing is just handing out the money. So almost certainly they're using it less effectively than the private sector. So in that case, again, we would probably see a decrease in the growth rate. The other option, of course, is to just print money. Maybe we go ahead and monetize this increase in expenditure. We just print a bunch of money and we hand it out. We send out these checks for $1,200. Now, it turns out in this day and age, we don't even have to print the money. We can just electronically put it into people's bank accounts. It's effectively still an increase in the money supply. So will that stimulate the economy? Again, we don't have a model here to talk about how it might productively stimulate the economy. That's something we're going to have to add in here in a moment. But for our point of view here at this point, it can stimulate the economy, but it's going to stimulate the economy by tricking a bunch of people. People say, ooh, I have more money. And of course, they have more cash. But within a short period of time, they go look and buy goods and services, and they are going to discover that the price level has increased. Of course, in the current environment, that may well not even happen because the velocity rate has plummeted, and so maybe the increase in the money supply is going to bring us back to a point where we have a stable price level because the extra money that is being distributed is exactly counterbalancing the contraction in velocity. That's a possibility here. But again, these tools don't give us direct answers, but they allow us to start to tell better stories. All right, so let's look here if we think about between lenders and borrowers. So hopefully that makes sense that there's redistribution between citizens and other citizens in the goods markets. How about between lenders and borrowers? Well, if you lent me money at 10%, but inflation was 10%, what is your return? It turns out your return is going to be zero because I'm going to repay you 10% more money at the end of a year, but that money is going to buy you 10% less than it would before. And what that would mean is that we've seen no change. And so you and I, in other words, would be willing to borrow and lend at the market rate of interest determined in our market for loanable funds. In our market for loanable funds, that market clearing interest rate is our real interest rate. It's, in other words, the interest rate if the inflation rate was 0. So you and I both say, yeah, you're willing to lend me money at 10%. I'm willing to borrow at 10%. At the end of the day, though, if inflation is 10%, you get a return of 0, 10% less, right? You go from expecting an inflation rate or a return of 10%, you get 0. You're going to be upset. I, on the other hand, I was willing to pay a 10% interest rate, and I end up paying 0. So this, again, the key here is that there's been redistribution from, in that case, from you as a lender to me as a borrower. On the other hand, if you lent me money at 20%, expecting inflation to be 10%, in other words, the rate at which we would both, the real rate of return that we were both willing to lend at or borrow at would be 10%. I was willing to borrow at 10% and pay you 10% to get that loan, and you were willing to lend to me at 10% in real terms. And so basically we write a contract with a nominal interest rate of 20% so that our real interest rate is 10%. But we discover that the inflation rate was actually 5% instead of 10%. And so now I pay you 20% more than I borrowed. And that 20% more is only worth 5% less instead of 10% less. And so in this case, the rate of return, the real interest rate for you, the real rate of return would be 15%. You would be getting more. You would be having resources redistributed from me as a borrower to you as a lender. So what? Why would these things be problems? Well, remember, if inflation is unpredictable, then we might have a spread at which it's too big. I might insist on only paying 10% nominal interest because I'm worried that inflation might redistribute from me. And you might insist on 25%. In other words, there might be a spread where we simply can't come to an agreement. This basically can break down the whole financial intermediation system. This isn't so much that people have a right not to be affected, it's that if we can't form predictions, reasonable predictions about what the inflation rate is going to be, then we may just not sign contracts at all. And this can break the whole financial intermediation system, which means that savings does not make it across the bridge, which means our investment line in our solo model would shift down, which means our growth rate in the economy would shift down. So hopefully that makes sense. And now we can zoom in more closely. So here, if we want to think about this and formalize this here, we have R sub actual, which would be our real rate of return. I could just put that as R. I is the nominal interest rate. It's the rate that you see in contracts in the market, but it is not the real interest rate. Omega here is the inflation rate. The book uses pi. I don't like using pi because we use pi for profit as well, so I try to avoid doing that, so I'm going to just use omega here. And E omega is going to be our expected inflation rate. So we never know for sure what the inflation rate is going to be until after the fact. And so what we're going to choose based on is our expectations of these things. And so when we put these together, what we end up with here is that the actual rate of return is the nominal rate minus inflation. So as we dealt with earlier, if we have a 10% nominal rate and inflation is 10%, then this real return is going to be 0. On the other hand, if our nominal interest rate is 20% and our actual inflation rate is 5%, then our real return is going to be 15%. And so we think about this, the rate at which we would all agree to sign contracts, our nominal interest rate, would be the amount of inflation we expected plus our market clearing interest rate. And so we can now substitute in here that the actual rate of return, our actual real rate of return, is going to equal the expected inflation plus the market clearing interest rate minus actual inflation. How did we get there? Math, right? If R actual equals I minus omega and I equals expected omega minus R market, then we just substitute in, and then we can rearrange. And we can say that our actual rate of return, or the real rate of return, is going to be expected inflation minus actual inflation plus our market clearing interest rate. And so when our expected inflation and our actual inflation are equal, there would be no redistribution. Our actual return, or our real rate of return, is going to equal our market clearing rate of interest. However, when the expected inflation is greater than or less than actual inflation, we are going to have redistribution. Now, it turns out one of the questions would be, is this how people really make decisions? And here's some information that would at least cause us to think seriously that they do. This tells us that the nominal interest rate tends to increase with actual inflation rates. Now, it wouldn't be surprising that these don't perfectly match each other because people are trying to predict the future and people get things wrong, but they tend to move pretty closely together. So the book has this table that says when you have unexpected inflation. Now here's the issue. If you had expected inflation, we would all just write that into our contracts. In other words, expected inflation would be equal to actual inflation. Now again, you'll notice the book is using pi, I use omega. So if you go all the way over to the right, when expected inflation is equal to actual inflation, the real rate is going to be equal to the market clearing rate. And there's going to be no redistribution between lenders and borrowers. We both get what we expected out of the deal, and we both pay what we expected out of the deal. However, when there's unexpected inflation, in other words, expected inflation is less than actual inflation, you can go look back at that calculation, and you'll discover that the actual rate of return is less than our market clearing rate. And what that would mean is we have redistributed from lenders to borrowers. We're harming lenders and we're benefiting the borrowers. On the other hand, when we have unexpected disinflation, in other words, expected inflation is greater than actual inflation. So in other words, that's not deflation. Deflation would be actually negative inflation. In that case, the real rate of return is going to be greater than the equilibrium rate. So the real interest rate is going to be greater than our market clearing rate, which would mean we have redistributed from borrowers to lenders. Borrowers end up paying more than they expected to, and lenders end up receiving more than they expected to. So again, the key here is that unexpected inflation and unexpected disinflation can redistribute just like between borrowers and lenders, just like we had redistribution between citizens. And what this can yield actually is negative interest rates. In other words, in Argentina between 1975 and 1976, the real interest rate was negative 69%. And of course, what happens? If you have to pay for the privilege of sending your money across the bridge, what's going to happen? Of course, when real interest rates are negative, people are going to want to borrow as much as they can, right? There's going to be a heck of a lot of demand for loanable funds. But there's going to be a very low supply because people simply are not going to send their money across the bridge when they have to pay for it, for the privilege. And so you can see here that negative interest rates cause almost certainly a reduction in the rate at which savings makes it across the bridge, which shifts our investment line down in our solo model, which causes a reduction in output. And in this case, it actually caused negative growth rates, not just a decrease in growth rates, but it caused negative growth rates. It caused the economy to contract. Now, to be fair, this isn't 100% clear that there's direct causality here. There might be correlation, or there might be something else that is causing both a negative real interest rate and a negative growth rate. But a lot of research does point to, and theory points to, and if we think this through, that a negative real interest rate is clearly contributing to negative growth. Now, We'll finish this up here with a couple of comments. Government is oftentimes a borrower, and it turns out that unexpected inflation redistributes from lenders to borrowers. So as we've already talked about, the federal government may not be monetizing its debt right now, may not just be printing money to pay for these stimulus checks. However, if they are borrowing money to do so, government officials and the Treasury are going to benefit from an unexpected inflation, and so the more government borrows, the more we would expect there to be political pressures to monetize the debt, to redistribute from the people who have lent the money to the federal government to the bureaucrats and others. Now, you may say, look, the federal government doesn't default on its debts. The federal Treasury rate, the rate of return on long-term government bonds is deemed, you may have heard in some of your classes, it is the risk-free interest rate. It doesn't mean it's risk-free, it just is deemed to be one of the lowest risk investments. And so you may think, look, governments don't default on their debt. But it turns out governments regularly default on their debt. The federal government has not yet defaulted on its debt. Argentina has defaulted. Many other countries have defaulted on their debt. And so the more government borrows, the more I expect the pressures to be there to go ahead and engage in unexpected inflation. In other words, we just print off money to pay off our debt. Now, you could think about this on a private level. Now, again, government is not a private individual. It's a collection of individuals who are choosing according to their expected marginal benefit and expected marginal cost within a bureaucratic rule structure. But on a personal level, you could say that if I had a printing press in my basement to print off currency units that people would accept, I probably want to keep the value of those currency units fairly stable so that people can understand what I am doing and that they have an incentive to use these currency units. However, if I start running up massive debts, if I max out all of my credit cards, what's probably going to happen is sooner or later there's going to be an increasing pressure for me to just go ahead and print out a whole bunch of units of currency to pay and then pay off my debt. In effect, I will have gotten away with paying nothing back in real terms, even though I'm paying a lot back in nominal terms. And so the higher the government debt as a share of GDP, the more we would expect governments to default, but maybe not even default. Maybe they just go ahead and print off the currency. It turns out that Argentina has done this enough that basically nobody lends to the Argentinian government in the Argentinian currency units. If the Argentinian government wants to borrow money, it has to do so in US dollars because the Argentinian government cannot increase the number of dollars in circulation in order to pay back their debt. Now, if lenders to government are mainly domestic, I do worry about this, but there's at least a cost to government officials for monetization. In other words, people might get pretty pissed off and they might vote people out of office. There's at least some cost if we pay people back with freshly printed dollars rather than actual meaningful value. However, if the lenders are mainly foreign, that decreases the cost to monetizing the debt. And so what this tells us, at least from my point of view, is we've talked about earlier, you think about foreigners like people in China being willing to lend money to Americans and to the federal government. That almost certainly increases the supply of loanable funds, driving down interest rates and causing a larger quantity of loanable funds to make it across the bridge, shifting up our investment line in our solo model and increasing the growth rate. So there's reasons to be fond of foreign investment in this country. Certainly foreign lending to the government. However, we should also be this is the only reason I'm concerned about foreigners lending money to the federal government. It's not because they're taking our stuff. It's not because they're making us worse off directly. My concern would be that it would be reducing the cost to government officials of monetizing the debt, thus increasing the likelihood that the federal government will monetize the debt, and that subsequently we may well have a complete breakdown in financial intermediation. So that brings us to hyperinflation. So if inflation is high and predictable, I would argue there's no major effect on financial intermediation. However, the higher inflation gets, the more likely it is that we're going to make a mistake. And if inflation is unpredictable, there may be an unwillingness to sign contracts of any sort. There may be an unwillingness to engage in long-term investments. And this would cause a reduction in economic growth and financial intermediation and can cause the whole system to break down. At the extreme, people spend a lot of time and energy trying to convert their money into goods as soon as they get paid. And you will see this in eras of hyperinflation, is that instead of getting paid every 2 weeks, oftentimes people end up getting paid every day. And as soon as they get their pay, they run out to buy absolutely anything. They want to convert. They don't want the stuff, but basically they know that if they don't, by the next day, their pay is going to be worth dramatically less. So that in and of itself is a massive reallocation, or actually a waste. There's no reallocation there. There's just a waste of time and energy competing for the goods. And so there's some nice examples, some classic examples. 1920s Weimar Germany here. We have kids playing with what look like wooden blocks, but instead they are bundles of Reichsmarks. And here we have the same thing. Right? This is what it took to buy a loaf of bread in Germany in 1923. So you think about what this means is you had to trundle off down to the bread store to buy a loaf of bread with these bales of money. And not only was that a hassle and took more time and energy, but it also meant we took this wheelbarrow out of productive use in the economy. It's no longer being used to move stuff around. People were lighting their fires with Reichsmarks rather than, and I know I'm saying that wrong, the CH is a sound that really is very difficult for the American palate to pronounce. But it was cheaper to use this than kindling. People would wallpaper their houses with money. People might have even wiped their bum with this money. So it actually makes perfect sense why people in Zimbabwe were actually using dollars rather than toilet paper. Now, one last point here, I think it's the last point, last major point, is that taxes and inflation interact. Because most taxes or tax brackets are defined in nominal terms. So tax brackets determine the rate at which we pay taxes over the last 50 years, right? Say that the rate at which your taxes went up was maybe at $50,000 20 years ago, you were determined to be in a higher tax bracket. That $50,000 stays fairly stable, but of course, what $50,000 represents is a falling income across that time. In other words, $50,000 20 years ago might have been a fairly reasonable income. $50,000 today is a lot lower standard of living and a lot lower purchasing power. And so what that means is that taxes have gone up. Even though they may not have gone up in nominal terms, they've gone up in real terms. So, big picture, the takeaways: in the long run, money is neutral, but at the extreme, money can have a huge impact in the short run. However, the main way that government can stimulate the economy in this instance is with a cattle prod rather than in a kindly caress, right? The case I would make here is that uncertainty is the big problem, and it turns out stopping inflation once it has gotten out of hand is extremely painful. And so here's what 10 US dollars is in Zim currency, right? And here's a kid looking a lot similar to 1920s Weimar Germany with his bundle of cash here. All right, so that is